Odds are if you're here, you're probably doing some research, trying to figure out what knife you want next. The problem with just cruising around online is that people use a lot of words that most of us don't know what they mean. The goal today, we're gonna dumb some of those down, add some clarification, make the internet a less scary place. So first up, let's look at the different parts of a knife. We're gonna start at the back and work our way around. We got the handle. No surprises, lots of different shapes. You might like one shape more than another. This is a Japanese style handle. Western handles, we'll look at those a little later on. Then we've got the collar on the handle. This is a small piece of wood or buffalo horn or even sometimes plastic. They put that on there to kind of help the knife or the knife handle from, it's a little bit tougher so it doesn't swell or shrink or splinter. We get in here, we got the tang of the knife. The tang is a little kind of sharp bit that extends into the handle, piece of metal that goes to about back here in the handle, right? That's what keeping the knife and the handle connected. We work our way across. You got the spine of the knife, the back of the knife, right? We got the tip. Sometimes people call it a toe. Not that often. Along here, you've got the edge, the sharpened bit. Sometimes in Japanese, you call that the koba, the actual edge. And then the heel is the back part of the knife. When you get in here, this is a weird one. People call this the choil. And the choil is kind of what comes in contact with your finger. Sometimes people are concerned about that, you know, being a certain amount of smooth or not. People ask for a photograph from here. The idea is they're trying to see how thin the blade is, right? You've got on either side of the knife, up here, we call the side of the knife is the face of the knife. So you got the left face and the right face. Often the face is where you'll see a lot of the artistry, right? Either through the engraving or the finish on the blade, you know, whether it's kurouchi or tsuchime. I really like the moritakas. This is the ishime finish, means rock face. It's pretty cool. And then this shiny bit on this particular knife is called a shinogi or a primary bevel, right? That's where you kind of start the grinding to shape the knife towards the edge. So now we know what the different parts of the knife are. Now we're gonna look at different knives. Everything's got a different job. We've got some of the greatest hits here, plus a couple of more, I don't know, adventurous, different knives. This is a petty knife. It's often called a utility knife. Think of it as a paring knife, essentially. Just sometimes they're a little bit bigger, right? But they do make them anywhere from about 75 to 80 millimeters long, up to 150. So you can do almost anything with these. Use it as a boning knife, small vegetables, peeling a potato, whatever. Here we've got a santoku. Santokus are, think of it as a mini chef's knife. Chef's knife that I like to use is about that big. This guy's a little bit shorter. Good for all your kind of basic chopping. A lot of people really like a santoku. This rectangular knife is called a nakiri. It gets its name from, I think it means leaf cutter. It's for cutting greens, veggies. The nice flat profile really lends itself to that style of kind of push cutting, people will say. All that means is that you're not rocking your knife, you're just sliding it through the food. A gyuto is the ubiquitous chef's knife. It looks like a European chef's knife. The shape, it's got a lot more belly, right? That was a word we referred to earlier, the edge there, meaning it's gonna rock a lot more easily. This particular one has what we call a Western style handle, which adds a couple of bits of anatomy to it. We've got a bolster and we've got some rivets. Chef's knife, you can do everything with it. Now we're getting into some more interesting shapes. They look like chef's knives, but they've got a pretty funky tip on them. The smaller one is often called a bunka. Think of it as a santoku with a cooler tip. The finer point might make it a little bit better for maybe scoring a piece of meat or something that's particularly delicate. And then we've got this one, which is called a kurouchi. Traditionally, a kurouchi is a single bevel knife, but you see more and more of them now, and it's really referring to something that's gyuto sized with that angled tip. You've probably seen a few of our videos where we use a hanasuki. Hanasukis are a knife designed for poultry butchery. You know, chickens, ducks, geese, whatever. The idea is that it's got a very fine edge and a very pointy point, but the knife itself is a little more rugged. Don't have to worry so much when you're around the bones. This guy is pretty impressive. It's called a tsujihiki. The tsujihiki is a carving knife. All right, you've just had a beautiful roast out on the table. Every now and again, maybe you use it for filleting a fish, but it's nice and long. It's not very tall. Makes it good for gliding through cooked meats or raw fish. This is a weird one. It doesn't show up that often. It's a relatively new shape. as far as Japanese knives are concerned, and we call it a kamigata. Think of it as, this one is big, but think of it as a baby nikiri. Generally quite flat, it's not as long. The first knife I bought for my mom was a kamigata. There's another one from Masashi-san. This is called a ko bunka. So when you see the word ko in relation to a knife, or I guess maybe another Japanese phrasing, ko means little. So it means a little bunka. You just use it the same as you would a bunka, maybe you just got smaller hands. Yeah, if you ever see the word ko in front of a knife, you can just assume that it's a bit smaller, right? Ko santoku, ko nikiri. I've never seen ko gyuto, but maybe it's out there. We've got what are called single bevel knives. So everything we've looked at so far are double beveled, meaning that the knife is sharpened more or less equally on either side. But when we look at a single beveled knife, you can see our shinogi, our primary bevel, but then the back is very different, right? The idea here is these are the more traditional knives. Even though this deba, which is a knife used for filleting fish, is a lot heavier, is a lot thicker than most other knives, because of the geometry, the edge is actually much thinner. Makes it very easy for filleting a fish. Now, something to keep in mind with single bevel knives is that it's very important to make sure you're getting the right one. I'm left-handed, and only one of these knives on the table is appropriate for me. A yanagiba is a single beveled version of our tsujihiki. It's often used for, we use the deba first to fillet the fish, deal with the bones, cut off the head, all of the rough and tumble stuff. It's the yanagiba's job. Sometimes you hear them called a yanagi. We're talking about the same thing generally. But a yanagiba is for slicing the fish fillets. You've already done the hard work, now we're doing the nice beautiful slices. And this one might look familiar if we're gonna compare it to our nikiri. Same jobs, but this one's called an asuba. And an asuba, same sort of thing, it's for your vegetable garnishes. I can't do this. I've heard that Naoto can, but this is where you see that rotary cutting technique with daikon or cucumbers. You get the whole paper thin sheet and then you julienne it from there. It's pretty impressive to see. This monster is called the chuka-bocho, which is a Chinese cleaver. That's chuka refers to China, bocho means knife. You've probably seen a ton of videos on here, you know, ours or other people's, of some pretty impressive cleaver skills. The idea behind a Chinese cleaver is that they're made, there's different widths, there's different edges. The shape is kind of the same across the board, but you might buy a big heavy one if you're dealing with squash, and you might buy a really thin, delicate one if you're dealing with cabbages. A really versatile knife, and we've got some staff around totally in love with them, use them for everything. So the word chuka-bocho is what we say when the knife comes out of Japan. If it was a knife made out of China, we would call it a Chinese cleaver. Another spot where you might notice a whole bunch of Japanese words that don't make a lot of sense to you is when it comes down to the finish of the knife. Right? There's a lot of opportunity for confusion there. So let's hopefully, you know, I think we can clear some of it up for you. One of the most common ones that people like to talk about is something called Damascus or suminagashi. The idea here is that the steel, through kind of layering it up and welding it together, maybe folding it, maybe not, maybe kind of doing some cool artistic cutting of the steel, we're left with a layered appearance, right? So if you hear Damascus, you hear suminagashi, think of this layered kind of look. Like if you cut a croissant in half, that's Damascus. Another really common one is called kurouchi. Now kuro is the Japanese word for the color black. All right, so maybe that'll help you remember some. Kurouchi knives generally have this black burnt appearance to them. Really cool thing about it is that most knives have that appearance to it, and if it doesn't have it on there by the time that they're finished making the knife, it's because they've polished it away. Some people who are prone to jargon will call it a KU finish. I guess KU, kurouchi, it kind of makes sense. One of my favorite ones is a tsuchime finish. So what you get with a tsuchime finish is these kind of intentional hammer marks. The nice thing about that is that when you're cutting like a dense food or something that's a little prone to sticking, the increased surface area left behind from the hammer mark prevents some of the suction that might occur. Your food doesn't stick as much. So here's a good example of the kurouchi and the tsuchime. The Moritaka family call this ishime, which means rock face. It's kind of cool. You get the rough texture from the tsuchime, and then you get the kurouchi, the black finish. You'll see these days a lot of blacksmiths, Kurosaki does this a lot, creating new finishes where you're using tsuchime techniques but creating different patterns. It's a really cool thing to see. This one is called a nashiji finish. So the way you get this is you take your knife, and after it's out and you've got your kurouchi is left on there and the knife itself has cooled down some, you hammer it to knock some of the flakes of that kurouchi off, and it leaves an almost imperfect finish. It's the kind of thing that I like. It proves that your knife is handmade. Every knife is a little bit different. No matter how good you are at it, you can't do the same thing twice with this type of finish. It takes the name nashiji from the word for the Asian pears, the nashi pears. All right, so this one is called a migaki finish. Kind of has the appearance of like the brushed steel up here. It's been polished a bit. It might look plain, but it takes a lot of work to get a knife to this point. So keep that in mind when you're taking a look at them. There's something really classy about a migaki finish. From the migaki finish, you can continue polishing, and that's where you get into the really shiny stuff, the mirror finishes and whatnot. You just kind of keep going up and up and up, reducing the grit size of your polishing. A lot of the time you'll see a word used to describe the bevel of the knife, a kasumi finish. It's not the whole face of the blade, it's usually just on the primary bevel here, where the kind of the core steel has been polished up and is very shiny, like a mirror almost, depending on how far you go. And then the rest of the bevel is a little foggier. So another common place to get tripped up is the materials that they use to make the knives, right? Especially the steel. You can kind of categorize most of the steels into 4, maybe 5 different categories. Stainless steel knives, right? Very easy to take care of. They're not going to give you a hard time. Make sure you're still drying them off, but they shouldn't rust unless you're being quite negligent. You know, like VG10s and AUS8 and molybdenum, vanadium, and ginseng. Like, they're all stainless steels, okay? Next up, you got carbon steel. You got white carbon steels, blue carbon steels. Sometimes you see something called yellow carbon steel, or a tool steel is often a carbon steel. The thing to keep in mind there, going to be a little more maintenance. Right off the hop, carbon steel is prone to rusting if left wet or left in a humid environment. You know the difference between white carbon steel, blue carbon steel. White carbon steel is iron plus carbon. And then blue carbon steels, they add in some other stuff like tungsten and chromium. It kind of changes the reactiveness of the steel. Like, it might rust not quite as quickly. It also gets a little bit harder. Harder means sharper, generally speaking. It can also mean a little more brittle, so be careful about chipping. A really fun way to make a knife is they take the two ideas and stick them together, where you've got a carbon steel core with a layer of stainless on the outside. And what that does is it makes a knife that is a lot easier to take care of, but you still get the performance of the carbon steel. The edge of the knife, like on this Fujimoto, the edge of the knife is still prone to rust and building a patina, but the rest of the knife is going to be a lot easier to take care of. So a lot of the time when we're talking about that combination of stainless steel and carbon steel, you'll hear the word clad or cladding. So this knife, made by Fujiwara-san, is a white carbon steel clad in stainless steel. Essentially, when you hear the word clad, you can think of the knife as it's wearing a little jacket of stainless steel. It's not that complicated. There's another category we call semi-stainless steels. They don't come around quite so often. The idea with a semi-stainless steel, like Masashi from Sanjo, he often uses a semi-stainless called VS1. Sometimes you'll see HAP 40. HAP 40 is an ultra hard steel, makes some of the most resistant blades out there. Also considered a semi-stainless steel because as the steel ages, it does change in appearance, right? It's not going to rust on you as easily as, say, a white carbon steel, where some days if you look at them sideways, they rust on you. But you know, HAP 40, for instance, I have a knife made out of HAP 40. The entire edge is turned almost black with patina, but it's never rusted. VS1 is kind of similar. I know the assistant manager in Ottawa, his name's Alex, he has a Masashi Santoku made out of VS1, and there is a little black circle from where he pinches the knife. It's kind of neat. If you're into your knife developing a bit of character as time goes on, carbon steels, VS1 steels, or the semi-stainlesses, they're well worth the effort. Finally, the last category is what we call powdered stainless steels or high-speed tool steels, words like that. It's a different type of stainless, which, to be completely honest, my 2 years of culinary school have not equipped me with a way to explain how they put it together. But the idea is you get a stainless steel that is going to perform or outperform carbon steels. Super hard, makes super sharp knives that stay sharp for a really long time. The only drawback really is that they can be a little more difficult to sharpen. But 9 times out of 10, that's not even your problem, that's my problem. So that covers a lot of the common knife vocabulary or glossary, if it were, that we like to use around here. But if you're cruising around, you're doing your own research, you're on a whole bunch of different websites or checking out some forums, you might come across some terms that don't make a lot of sense to you. We work really hard not to use those words when we're trying to help you. And we don't want to confuse things. We want to make sure that you have a good time, that you get to pick out a knife you're going to love. We don't want you to think you got to pass a spelling bee to go home with an awesome knife. Some of the jargon you might hear, right off the hop, the one I hear the most often, talking about something called a full tang. Hey, does that knife have a full tang? What that's referring to is that we talked about the tang as being a part of the blade that extends into the handle. Well, a full tang is when the entire handle has metal running through it, like on this one. Now, years ago, some companies did a really good job telling everybody that a good knife had a full tang and 3 rivets. All it means is that there's more metal in the handle. You may or may not like that. You want a lighter knife? You might want to avoid a knife described like that. While we're on the topic of handles, there's obviously different types, right? We got a more European style, a Western style, sometimes called a yo handle, Y-O, yo, all right? As opposed to a Japanese handle, which is often called a wa handle. One of the big things that really gets kind of people's guts in a knot is when we start talking about Rockwell hardness. If you see the abbreviation HRC, that's telling you that the number associated to that, say it says HRC 61:62, that's telling you that using the Rockwell hardness scale with like the Rockwell C hardness scale, you've got an expected hardness of 61:62. What that means ultimately is someone took a pretty sciencey gadget and set it up to the C parameters, a very certain kind of pin and a certain amount of weight, and they measured how far the steel got penetrated by that little pin with that amount of weight behind it. That's where they get that number. The reason why that number might be important to your knife is it's going to tell you the higher the number, the harder the steel is. Harder steel makes a sharper knife that's going to stay sharper for longer. So the higher the number, the harder the steel. Keep in mind though that the higher the number, the harder the steel. That sometimes means the steel can be very brittle. And if you're a bit of a more rough and tumble, maybe you're a big industrial chef, maybe a super high Rockwell hardness isn't the right knife for you. A lot of the time when you're cruising around on forums and checking out all kinds of websites, you'll see a lot of measurements come up. People want to know, well, what's the expected size of the knife, right? We always talk about the length of the knife. Some people will ask, what's the height of the knife? They want a measurement from the spine to the edge or the belly. They want to know the width of the spine sometimes. So maybe they're looking at that. But a weird one is people will ask about the distal taper. Now what that means is how much does the knife narrow as you approach the tip. Okay, you'll see it more commonly in handmade knives than stamped knives, but that's something there. That's the distal taper. It starts thick here and it gets thin down here. We hinted at it earlier, but sometimes when someone's looking for a knife, especially like a custom knife or something particularly unique, a customer or an enthusiast might ask for a choil shot. I swear it's not as dirty as it sounds, but what they want is a photograph from the handle end of the knife. Remember, this is the choil. They want a photograph from here because they want to see how thin the knife is. Sometimes you'll see the word ferrule, F-E-R-R-U-L-E. What someone is looking for there, ferrule is just another word for the collar on the handle. Sometimes you'll see it on more Western style knives where they get pretty decorative in this part of the knife. A lot of the time when people are looking at their knives, they'll start talking about different grinds, 70-30, 50-50, 60-40, that kind of thing. What they're referring to is, you know, the angle in which the knife is sharpened. If I can be perfectly honest with you, it's nothing to worry about. Humans aren't perfect. A lot of knives are sharpened by humans. So long as your knife doesn't take a hard left when it's not supposed to, I wouldn't stress out too much about it. Just keep in mind, like, you know, our single bevel versus double bevel conversation, and that should cover the bases there. One thing that I've come across a lot lately is people using, you know, maybe inappropriate abbreviations for things. A couple that come to mind right off the top of my head is a lot of people ask about JNATs. They're referring to Japanese natural stones, right? It's a sharpening stone that's been mined out of a mountain, and, you know, different blacksmiths like their stone. Just, you know what, type out the whole thing. Another one that I think would get you in a lot of trouble if you were in the same room with the guy is a lot of people these days will refer to a knife by Fujiwara, or they'll refer to Fujiwara-san as TF. His name is Terayasu Fujiwara. It makes sense, but you know what, the man has spent a long time, longer than I've even been around, perfecting his art. And I think maybe it's a little disrespectful to not use his whole name. Just remember, these are people creating things that you use day in, day out. You know, use their whole name if you can. So that's a lot of information in a short period of time. And to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of it's not even necessary. If you don't know any of those words, you can still enjoy your knife, have a good time in the kitchen, right? If you need any help with that sort of thing, leave us a comment below. Is there one we didn't get? Put it down there. One of us will be in touch. We'll let you know what the answer is. If you want to learn more about the shapes and what they do, you know, obviously like our video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, but check out this video coming up that really goes into every knife shape, what you do with it, what makes it special. And if that doesn't cover it, you can always reach out to us at hello@knifewear.com.